studying the cycle of violence, what has been called the cycle of violence, and I'm going to define that in a minute, for a long time. And I rarely, even though I'm asked, I rarely talk to journalists. And part of the reason I take that position is because the work that I do, and this has influenced me in terms of what I'm going to present for you today, is complicated. And I feel that it's very difficult to convey the complexities of a set of findings about various phenomena in ways that then can be reported. So what I'm going to try to do today is to maybe shake you up a little bit about some of the beliefs that you may have. Some of you may be familiar with the cycle of violence, but I'm going to show you the evidence. And I was really encouraged by the solutions journalism talk because I think it allows then for the kinds of complexities and nuances that I would like to see. So I'm going to talk about the cycle of violence and other paths to violent offending. Next. So how do we get next? This? Okay, I have 4 takeaway points. I'm going to tell you what I want to say up front, and then I'm going to tell you why I'm making these statements. First one is, there is a cycle of violence, but it is more complicated than most people believe. The second is that the paths to violence are not uniform. They are diverse. The third point is that there is an assumption that children who were sexually abused go on to become sex offenders. This is not correct. They are not at unique risk for becoming sex offenders compared to other children, physically abused children, and neglected children. And I'll tell you why. And third, another form of the cycle of violence is the intergenerational transmission of child abuse and neglect. And again, there is evidence for an intergenerational transmission, but there's also evidence of surveillance bias. So those are the 4 points. So just a bit of history so you know where I'm coming from and why the research that I'm going to tell you about is different than most of the research that you write about, read about, have confidence in. So I'm a psychologist and a criminologist. Criminologists and sociologists have spent a lot of time talking about structural and subcultural causes of violence. But in the 1960s, a group of psychiatrists and psychologists became interested in connections between child abuse and violence. So that was clinical observations, case studies, very weak science, but generating hypotheses. In the 1970s, people started to do cross-sectional studies of delinquent adolescents and patient groups, trying to establish this connection. But you know, and you all write this when you write a story that is a cross-sectional study or describing findings, that doesn't say anything about causality. We often pay lip service and we slide into this must have caused that. But really, it is associated, but we know nothing more about it. So that was a limitation. It's a snapshot of a relationship at a point in time. In the 80s, there were some neat studies of very young children who had been abused and neglected, who were exhibiting lots of aggression. I reviewed all of this material and designed a study that I thought would overcome many of these methodological problems. And so only in the late 1980s did we have the first major prospective longitudinal study on the cycle of violence. The cycle of violence, very narrowly defined, is that children who were physically abused become perpetrators of violence when they grow up. So violence leads to violence. And that's what mostly we're going to talk about. So since I did the first study that was published in Science in 1989 and received a lot of press coverage, there have been 6, wow, my map is screwed up. 6 major prospective longitudinal studies in different geographic regions, time periods, children of different sexes and ages, and types of assessment. The areas where this is wrong, but basically several areas on the East Coast, Northeast, Southeast, Midwest, and Northwest. 6 major longitudinal replications showing the findings that there is a cycle of violence, that children who have been physically abused go on to become perpetrators of violence. And what this does, it supports the generalizability of these findings and increases our confidence in this relationship, okay? So we know that each study has limitations, but the fact that it has been replicated, we have confidence. However, it is more complicated. So from my data, what this shows is the rate of percent with any violent arrest for children who have documented cases of physical abuse, sexual abuse, and neglect, and very importantly, a matched control group who are matched on the basis of age, sex, race, and approximate family social class. And I can talk later, if anyone is interested, in why that matching on social class is critical. But you can see here that this matched control group has lower rates of being arrested for violent crime than the physical abuse and neglect, and about the same as multiple. But sexual abuse, even though we know sexual abuse is more often experienced by girls and women, even if you control for sex there, the rate of violence among sexually abused children when they grow up, so these are followed into the future, is lower. The other important takeaway from this slide is you see this group of neglected children. So my hypothesis about the cycle of violence was that physically abused kids would become perpetrators of violence. I didn't say anything about neglect. But in the US, neglect represents 70 to 80% of all reports of child maltreatment. Physical abuse and sexual abuse are relatively uncommon compared to neglect. So I want you to take that percent, that a fifth of neglected children followed up into the future are going to have an arrest for violence. And pay attention to it, and I'll come back to that. The other reason that this story is complicated is when we look, and I'm going to show you a couple of things to show you that context matters, that there are important differences for black and white. I'm more confident about that because we have larger samples for the black and white children in our study. That something is happening differently. These are new findings. We haven't figured out why, but I want to provoke you, and I want you to think about it when you write stories to ask what's going on. So let me explain. This top section here is having an arrest. An arrest as a juvenile. So the column says juvenile. That means any juvenile arrest. The next row is juvenile violent. Any violent arrest as a juvenile. Then any arrest and any violent arrest through adulthood. And then these are odds ratios, or times that the person is more likely to be arrested than the matched controls of the same race. So what you see pretty dramatically here, I hope, are the black children, black abused and neglected children, is that for all types, juvenile, juvenile violent, any arrest, any violent, the black abused and neglected children are significantly more likely to be arrested than the black non-abused and neglected children. All those red numbers. You don't see so much of that red over here for the white abused and neglected children compared to the white controlled. For the white abused and neglected kids, maltreated kids, you see an increase in risk for being arrested for juvenile crime, for being arrested in general. But you don't see a significant increase for violence, for being arrested for violence. And for the Hispanics in our sample, you actually see a decrease in risk for arrest for violence. But again, that's not as reliable because it's a much smaller sample. So those are arrests. That's the official response to maltreated children. But there's a lot of debate in the criminological literature about whether arrests are really good indicators of violence, or whether they miss violence, or they perhaps are biased in some way. So there are those people in the field of criminology who like to use self-reports of violence, or self-reports of delinquent behavior. So the bottom half of this chart, the same group of people, is we ask them, have you ever done any of these things? And we ask them about a whole bunch of behaviors that are traditionally considered violent behaviors. And what do you see? Okay. So instead of those red, significant, highly significant differences up there, you see this NS. That NS means, I'm trying to simplify this for you, that NS means there's no significant difference in the self-reports of the black maltreated children compared to the black non-maltreated children. On the other hand, you see for white maltreated children compared to white controls, you see a significant difference. So what this means is that there's a totally different picture that you get when you look at arrests and when you look at self-reports. White abused and neglected children are saying they do more violence, but they're not getting arrested for violence. Black abused and neglected children are not saying they're doing more violence, but they're getting arrested for violence. So moving on, there are many paths to violence which I want to call your attention to. So I've shown you now that child abuse and neglect is one pathway to violence. We don't understand why, what it is about child abuse and neglect, and I'll keep saying neglect to just remind you. But interestingly, violence occurs without a history. So it's not like 100% of the people who are engaging in child abuse and neglect is not the ultimate, absolute cause of violence. It is perhaps a cause of violence. But we know, for example, that the school shooting perpetrators did not, as far as I could tell, I wasn't involved in any of the cases examining them, but they did not involve a history of child abuse and neglect. I looked to see. And And there are other instances where violence can occur, as you know, in conjunction with post-traumatic stress disorder. And criminologists don't pay attention to these cases of violence in conjunction, in general, with PTSD. But I call your attention to them that there is sometimes violence that happens in the context of mentally ill individuals who have PTSD. There's a whole debate about military personnel who have experienced combat exposure, who have developed PTSD, who may be involved in violence. These are questions and observations. The field is where the cycle of violence field was years ago. And among battered women who develop PTSD, who then murder spouses. So I suggest that there are definite varieties of paths to violent behavior. And what you can see, so this is all the violence in my sample, the same people we've been talking about. And what you can see is that almost a third of them are violent and don't have a history of child abuse and neglect, and don't have a history of PTSD. And that's probably where the criminologists may be talking about subcultural factors, structural factors. I'm not sure, but we need to, I think, recognize that not all violence is the result of child abuse and neglect. On the other hand, almost half, 49% of the violence in our sample is represented by children who have a history of abuse and neglect, who became violent. And then about 20%, 21% are children who were abused and neglected, have PTSD, and became violent. And what you see is that there are two differences, and we can determine this chronologically, temporally, from all the data that we've been collecting about these people over the years. So I would suggest that perhaps, and again, I'm offering this to you, and I would love you to pursue these questions. I would suggest that this could be the pattern of the battered woman who has a history of abuse and neglect, goes on to develop PTSD in the context of domestic violence, spouse abuse, and finally becomes violent. And this, it might be a different story, a story where individuals who have engaged in so much violence in a variety of contexts actually then develop PTSD. And this is just an example. If any of you are interested, I have an article that appeared in Criminology that really goes into a lot of the detail about this. But I just want to point out a couple of things. So this is psychiatric diagnoses at the age of 29, one of the times that we examined, we interviewed these people. And this red group, red bar, which has very high, the highest rates with the exception of depression, is the group who were violent and then developed PTSD. And this group, the green group, is the group that I suggested might be women who've been battered, who has higher rates of depression. But what's I think is so this is the kids who are controls, who don't have histories of violence or child abuse. And I think what's interesting is that if you look over here, this group is violence only, and this group is child abuse and neglect only. So they are not appearing to have the same extent of psychiatric problems. Similarly, lower here, than the groups, obviously, that have PTSD. The two more points. Assumption that policymakers act on is that children who were sexually abused grow up to be sex offenders. We published a paper in Archives of Pediatrics and Adolescent Medicine in January, and these are the results. It is not the sexually abused kids who become sex offenders. It is, it is the neglected kids and the physically abused kids. And what this tells me is that sex crimes are violent crimes, and it fits very well with this notion of a cycle of violence. But what is really important about this finding is that we are stigmatizing, isolating, segregating, doing lots of potentially very negative interventions for sexually abused youth, particularly boys, on the assumption that they will turn out to be sex offenders, and it's not correct. This is just a cool statistic showing you that it's the green is the physical abuse group. They start earlier, they're doing it more, and the blue is the neglected group. And here, this is the sexual abuse. Finally, the intergenerational transmission of abuse and neglect. This appeared in Science in March. So there is the notion that if you were abused or neglected as a child, you will become a perpetrator of abuse when you grow up and when you parent. And estimates have varied over the years, but okay. So the information, the data that we had up until this point was quite flawed and had serious limitations. So I set out to look at this question, get the same people that I've been studying all these years now, who now have their own children. So these are also really surprising findings, and I don't have answers. This is brand new. The NS again means it is not significant. That's the first thing that you need to know. Let's see. Okay. So across the top, we have the adults, what we call the G2 generation, who I've been studying all these years. So this is abuse and neglect, the whole sample, the people who with histories of physical abuse, people with histories of sexual abuse, the people with histories of neglect. And this is the type of maltreatment their offspring is at risk for. And what you see is CPS, G2 self-report, G3 self-report. And that's the same down here. So what this means is that we got Child Protective Service. There's no gold standard for determining child abuse and neglect. Most of the self-report measures are seriously flawed. So because of that, we use 3 sources of information. We use the CPS, which is the official report. We use the parents' report. That's the G2 self-report. And we use the kids' report. And by using all 3, we hope that we're going to get the best picture of whether there is an intergenerational transmission. So this whole section up here are all the indicators of physical abuse. We all think that if there's an intergenerational transmission of abuse and neglect, it's going to be in the context of physical abuse. It's not there. Not according to any of the sources. The kids are not saying they're being physically abused. The parents are not saying it, and CPS. Not the case for sexual abuse. So for sexual abuse, what you see consistently is that the children of parents who've been maltreated, parents maltreated, their children are at increased risk for sexual abuse, they are not telling us that they are doing this, but their kids are telling us that they are. So we're pretty confident that the offspring of parents with histories of maltreatment are at increased risk for sexual abuse. And the question is, who's perpetrating it? Under what's all these questions? And there also is evidence that these children are at increased risk for neglect. So I would suggest that there is evidence for an intergenerational transmission of abuse and neglect, but as I said before, it's complicated. So I'll explain this slide. So what you have here is the G2 parent. If the parent had herself or himself a history of abuse and neglect, their child was at increased risk for having a CPS report compared to this is among the people who say that they have engaged in some form of maltreatment, child abuse, or neglect. So it's only the people, the parent generation, who are saying it. So everybody here is guilty, okay, guilty of maltreatment. But the children of these parents are 2.5 times more likely to have a CPS report. Actually, the parents are more likely to have a CPS report, and the children are more likely to have a CPS report. So we are suggesting that there is a detection bias because all of these people, as I say, have said that they're engaging in this. So finally, takeaway points. I hope I've shown you that there are many paths to violent offending. Please don't oversimplify. Don't neglect. It is the Institute of Medicine has issued a report, a book on child abuse and neglect that came out in 1993 and said don't neglect. There's a new Institute of Medicine report that just came out in 2013 that says don't neglect. It is a huge problem in this country, and we are not paying adequate attention to it. Contextual factors, I suggested to you that race and having a history may play a role in what's happening, and consider the strength of the scientific evidence. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Widom. We have time for some questions, so please raise your hand. Tell us who you are. Yes. Speaking to the mic. Yep. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Hi.
Say who you are, please.
I'm Lori Leach from Threshold Global Works. In light of what we heard earlier about solutions journalism, are you or somebody else studying the larger portion of each of those circles of people who aren't doing those things to their kids, and what do we know about them?
I think what you're referring to are what we call resilience.
Yeah.
Right?
That.
Okay. We have published some papers on resilience, and all of this stuff is, with the exception of the cycle of violence direct stuff, is brand new. And I have a great group of students and colleagues who I work with, but it's a small group, and we can only pedal so fast. We work really hard, but as you can see, we have an enormous set of questions. And resilience is sort of on our list to find out what makes the difference. A really good question, but you know, I can give you some answers, not in terms of the intergenerational transmission, but in terms of a couple of things that we've learned over the years. One is that IQ makes a difference. So children who are smarter, brighter, perform better, and I don't mean that in terms of innate intelligence, I mean in terms of where they are, seem to do better, and we think that part of the reason is that they can escape into books, for example. If they do well in school, teachers will sort of pay attention to them. There are numerous examples of individuals who have just had brilliant careers, who had histories in foster care, and probably one of the things that has made the difference for them. Having a supportive person in individuals' lives, and that's complicated too, because for many children, we can say we want to give you a supportive person if you don't have one. But it may be that characteristics that they've developed, traits over the years, will push people away. So this is a real challenge. We've published a paper recently talking about the role of social support. It seems to really be important, even lasting into middle adulthood in terms of anxiety and depression. But that's something that's hard to impose if the world around you is, if your family is not being supportive. And the final thing is staying in school and graduating from high school. So we published another paper that suggests that even for abused and neglected children, if we can keep them in school longer, ideally to graduate with their classes so that it's not GED, I don't mean GED, that it's a normative thing, that they do much better in terms of subsequent outcomes than kids who don't. And I would like to see someone trying programs to target these kids to stay in school longer, even if it's 1 year longer or 2 years, even if they can't graduate, because if nothing else, it keeps them off the streets, you know, and not subject to sort of other delinquent kids who they may become easy prey. So a long answer, but.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions. Armando, and then Susan, then we'll have to stop there and go to the next time.
Professor Widom, my name is Armando. I work with the NPR station in Washington, D.C. I was wondering if in any of the analysis you looked at socioeconomic factors and poverty, because I didn't see that, and I was wondering what role poverty and socioeconomic conditions played.
Excellent, excellent question. So remember I said that these control children, these matched controls, are matched on the basis of age, race, sex, and approximate family social class. That's extremely important because these are court-substantiated cases of abuse and neglect. And we know that the kinds of cases that come to the attention of the authorities, whether it's the courts or whether it's CPS, are skewed, more heavily weighted with people from the lower socioeconomic statuses. So it would really be inappropriate to compare outcomes for children who are middle class and upper class, given that, I mean, there are some in our sample, but it's not, the predominant group are sort of lower SES classes. However, so that said, we always say we cannot generalize necessarily to maltreated children who are growing up in middle or upper class families. Why? Because if the only thing that's sort of going on in your life wrong is the abuse and neglect, and you have this incredibly supportive group around you, you may have different outcomes than children who are coming from families that are much more chaotic, that's associated with the abuse and neglect. But very specifically, people believe that poverty is a heavy overlay with neglect. Some people feel that it's really the poverty that's driving these negative consequences. It's not the neglect, and that neglected children are just poor. So one of the things that I did with a former postdoctoral fellow was to pit poverty and neglect in a series of analyses to address this question. So in a statistical way, we said, what results are the result of neglect, controlling for poverty, and what results are due to poverty and not neglect. And what we find is that there are independent effects depending on the outcome. But I think it's a really important question that we understand that. But I also think that we need to consider consequences of child abuse and neglect in middle and perhaps upper class samples. Does that answer your question?
I was wondering if within societies where you have extreme poverty or areas where you have extreme poverty, whether that generates any additional risk factors and any for PTSD or violence, and when it just becomes a self-perpetuating kind of a thing.
Actually, what's really interesting is that if you look away from the United States at some of the countries that have experienced incredible poverty, malnourishment, serious deprivation, you don't find the same rates of violence that we have in the United States. So I don't, just because a person is poor, I mean, it may sound trite, but it is really true. Poverty doesn't have to lead to neglect or physical abuse, and we certainly know that from looking at other countries internationally.
Okay, I have time for one short one. Susan?
It's okay, somebody else. I have a question.
Okay, I'd like to ask, can you, poverty and culture seem to me to be very much linked in the United States. Can you talk about that a little bit? In terms of violence and trauma.
I'm not sure I understand.
Poverty and culture, American culture, and being on the bottom of American culture, and all that means, seems to be very, I don't know what the stats are, but my observation is, it seems to me to be very much connected.
So I'm going to plead the fifth or the first or whatever and take the solutions journalism. I'm not an expert on rates of violence in general in the United States, or the rates of poverty. So certainly there are cultural differences in approval and use of physical discipline across the United States. And in fact, when I showed you that we did not find differences in terms of physical abuse for the intergenerational transmission, one possibility is that there was so much physical abuse, what we would consider physical abuse, going on in both groups. Abuse and neglect, parents with abuse and neglect histories and controls, that it didn't show up as different. And it is my understanding that only 19 states, have not signed on to prohibitions of physical discipline in schools, for example. So when you can do corporal punishment in schools, you're illustrating that physical punishment is an acceptable way. And I appreciate, but I think this is another example of how complicated it is, because in certain communities, reasoned, rational, thoughtful punishment, real discipline, consistent, is very important for the lives of kids growing up in certain areas. So we can't have just sort of like a simple little solutions, that are just sort of simplistic.
Just want to thank you so much for, please join me in thanking you.